Well, we're here on our study on Romans chapters 9, 10, and 11, looking at session number 6, verses 19 through 23 of chapter 9. Romans 9, 19 to 23. And we're trying to finish up some of the thought on the sovereignty from God's view. Last time we noted that Paul didn't elaborate on God's hardening of Pharaoh. He simply made the statement that Pharaoh was hardened, Pharaoh would be hardened. So that's where we are right now. But by examining the drama in Exodus, that's going to help us to understand that God was, in fact, just, fair, and righteous. The tool that we find there will prepare us for verses 19 and beyond. Egypt's Pharaoh, probably Amenhotep II, Amen, Hotep, 2. He appears to have been the most powerful human on earth at that time, if in fact that who it was. The events leading up to the Exodus constituted a power struggle between Pharaoh and God, one that Pharaoh was destined, of course, to lose. The purpose of that series of plagues, the 10 of those plus the last one, was to let the world see that the God of Israel is Yahweh. He is Lord. He is sovereign over nations, tribes, peoples, and events forever and always, and sovereign over Pharaoh and Egypt's many gods. The particular plagues that were chosen by God all aimed at some of Egypt's gods. Virtually all of them ended up being defeated in the midst of those plagues. Now, question, what was the dispute between God and Pharaoh all about? Well, remember the dispute between Pharaoh and God was over whom the Israelites would serve, God or Pharaoh. Before the confrontation, God spoke about the need for his mighty hand and said he would harden Pharaoh's heart. Prophetic statements, not something necessarily that had already been accomplished. Let me read from Exodus 3, where Yahweh is speaking to Moses in verses 19, 20, and 21. But, and this is God again speaking to Moses, I know that the king of Egypt will not permit you to go except under compulsion. So, I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my miracles, which I shall do in the midst of it, and after that he will let you go. And I will grant this people, that is the Hebrews, favor in the sight of the Egyptians, the Egyptian people, and it shall be that when you go, you will not go empty-handed. And remember, people gave them all kinds of stuff, including gold and silver, saying, get out of here, please, go. This was Moses' farewell message for his trip to Egypt, God's last message to him that we have record of before he took off and went to Egypt. Notice that the expression will harden, not have hardened. It was a prophetic statement. It says, I'm going to do a work here when this all takes place. God gave enough information to Moses to do a couple things, so that the people would have enough data to see the plan unfolded just as God said. So if Moses related that message to the people, God said there'll be enough for them to see, to know. They'll understand what's happening. So that they understood why certain events like the plague were needed. The Hebrews needed to understand, why are the plagues necessary? Well, it's because of the hardened heart of Pharaoh. That this was, and they needed to know that all along this has been a part of God's plan to gain glory as it unfolded and as his people would gain their freedom. You won't leave poor just with the clothes on the back. No, you're going to leave with riches of some sort. And a bit later in chapter 4, verse 21 of Exodus, and Yahweh said to Moses, and this was in preparation for the contest to come, when you go back to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders which I have put in your power. But I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Then beginning in Exodus 5, Pharaoh repeatedly denied request after request after request for the Hebrews to temporarily go out of Egypt and worship Yahweh in the wilderness and then return. All a temporary exodus. God again repeatedly spoke and referred to his mighty hand that would come against Pharaoh. So he had to keep reminding Moses and the people, you're going to see my power. You can easily miss the point God made about his power. He commissioned Moses to use his own power as needed. Will harden? It continued to imply that God had not yet acted to seal Pharaoh in his opposition. Was Pharaoh opposed to the Israelites, the Jewish? Well, neither of those fit at that time. They were not a nation. They were not called Jews until after the Babylonian captivity, apparently. But the will harden still implied that God had not yet acted to seal Pharaoh in his opposition. To that point, all of Pharaoh's opposition had been Pharaoh's own doing, his own stubbornness of heart, his own hardening of his own heart. In chapter 6 of Exodus, God made a promise to Moses. Then Yahweh said to Moses, for now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh. For under compulsion he shall let them go, meaning his people. And under compulsion he shall drive them out of his land. He said, not only will Pharaoh let you go, he's going to tell you and threaten you and say, get out of here. That's what Exodus 6:1 is telling us. Well, here's another note. Observe, God did not simply send Moses off to Egypt and then sit back and watch. He kept Moses updated and continually repeated how the process would play out. Moses didn't have to wonder. He didn't have all the details, of course, but he had enough to convince him to keep on keeping on. Exodus 7, verses 3 to 5. God speaking to Moses again. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart. Still hasn't done it. That I may multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt. He said, at some point, I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart in order that I will get plenty of opportunity in the land of Egypt to show my power and my miracles and who I am. When Pharaoh will not listen to you, then I will lay my hand on Egypt, not just Pharaoh, but all of Egypt, and bring out my hosts, my people, the sons of Israel, from the land of Egypt. He said, I'm going to keep doing this. You'll keep seeing my miracles. And by these great judgments, you're going to see your release. And verse 5, and the Egyptians shall know, not only you guys, but the Egyptians will know I am Yahweh when I stretch out my hand on Egypt. I stretch my hand out and show these plagues, these miracles, they'll know. And I'll bring out the sons of Israel from their midst. When Egypt sees you leaving, they will know it was me. It was I. I did it. But according to Exodus 7-9, particularly in verse 9, chapter 7, I don't know if there's some irony in that or not, Pharaoh repeatedly hardened his own heart. So God didn't have to do this in the beginning. Pharaoh's own recalcitrance was enough. And Pharaoh sent, and behold, there was not even one of the livestock of Israel. So this was well into the plagues. But the heart of Pharaoh was hardened, and he did not let the people go. Notice it doesn't say God hardened the heart of Pharaoh. It says, and the heart of Pharaoh was hardened by Pharaoh's own actions and decisions. And he did not let the people go. So after several of the plagues, they're still there. God says, no, I'm not finished yet. Excuse me. Finally, God did harden Pharaoh's heart, or at least finish the hardening process by giving him over to his own desires. God gave Pharaoh over to Pharaoh's own desires. This is in 9:12. And the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not listen to them, Moses and Aaron, just as Yahweh had spoken to Moses. Yahweh said, this is going to happen this way. And it did. But then Pharaoh continued hardening his own hearts. Even after God said, you wanted, you got it. Now Pharaoh's acting on his own. Even when his servants saw the handwriting on the wall, in Exodus 9:20, for example, the one among the servants of Pharaoh, it's his own people, who feared the word of Yahweh, they already had gotten the point. This God of Israel is powerful. Made his servants and his livestock flee in the house. That was the servant, or the plague on the livestock, going to kill every livestock out in the field. This servant said, get them in. Get them out of the fields. And then in Exodus 9:34, when Pharaoh saw that the rain and the hail, this is another plague, and the thunder had ceased, he sinned again and hardened his heart. He and Moses, most of his servants. So most servants are following what Pharaoh does. They're doing exactly as Pharaoh did. Pharaoh got stubborn, said no, even after this. And this is really late in the series of plagues. They all harden their own hearts. And even after the Passover, where the death angel passed over the land of Egypt, killing all firstborn that were alive, God again stated that he would, future, harden Pharaoh's heart as Pharaoh chose to take his army to stop Hebrews' exodus. So now, even Pharaoh has given the order, get them out of here, Moses. Take them all, go now. Don't stick around. I'm ordering you. Get out of here. And so even after that, and even after this death of his firstborn son, and Israel's now on the way out, Yahweh drew a line in the sand. Exodus 14, we're way down the line now. Verse 8, 14:8. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he chased after the sons of Israel. He had ordered them out. They had left. Now God says, okay, you're still ticked. And they chased after the sons of Israel. So now Pharaoh's leading his army to go out and reverse this exodus. And this was as the sons of Israel were going out boldly. They now had lots of guts, the Israelites did, because they had seen what God had done. And remember, in many of those plagues, he protected the Israelites, the Hebrews, he protected them while the people of Egypt suffered. God predicted that he would harden Pharaoh's heart so that, and look at what it brought about. The channel of dry land through the sea provided salvation for Israel. Remember, Moses held his staff up, the waters parted, the people went across on dry land. They went through saved from those in Egypt. But then when Moses went across, dropped his hands, the water closed back in and gave condemnation and judgment and death for the Egyptians, those in the army at least, who tried to follow the Israelites through the dry land in the Red Sea. Well, because of the duel between God and Pharaoh, that's what it was. Let's see who lasts longest. Remember, in the beginning, Pharaoh's magic men were able to mimic some of the things that Moses and God were doing. But eventually, that stopped. The magic guys of the magicians of Egypt could no longer duplicate what were those things called? The plagues that God was bringing on Israel. I'm having trouble focusing today. If you have any question in your mind about it. That anyhow, because of what it took to get the Israelites out of Egypt, all the world heard about, all the nations of the world heard about the God of Israel's power and his miracles. When the Israelites, in fact, entered Canaan, God hardened the hearts of the rival peoples as well. So God was in business along with the Israelites in this matter. What was God's purpose in hardening the hearts of Israel's enemies? Was that fair for God to do that? God wanted to completely destroy the Canaanites, who were extremely evil people, who chose to worship idols rather than Yahweh. Yes, God forbid that anyone should accuse God of injustice. Remember, How long were the Israelites, the Hebrews, in Egypt? 400 years. The Canaanites had over 500 years in which to accept Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob's testimony about Yahweh. They had over 400 to 500 years to react to Yahweh positively. They did not. They were so evil, they refused for 500 years about. And so God said, when you go into the land, they are so evil, they will corrupt you. You will no longer remain faithful to me. So I want you to wipe out every one of them. Man, God, man, woman, child. What difference would it have made had God softened Pharaoh's heart so that he would have released the Israelites upon the first time Moses asked? The world would not have given God credit for the Exodus. Who would have got credit? Moses and or Pharaoh. But God said, no, it will be my doing, and it will be known to have been my doing. Now, let's go back to see if we can get back in Paul's train of thought from Romans 9. Romans 9, verses 19, 20, and 21. This is Paul speaking again to the people in Rome, some of whom were Jews, some of whom were Gentiles. You will say to me then, why does he, Yahweh, still find fault? For who resists Yahweh's will? Paul answers, on the contrary, who are you, O man, who answers back to God? And now he goes into a metaphor. The thing molded will not say to the molder, why did you make me like this? Will it? And of course the Jews would be used to that metaphor. Paul goes on to explain for the Gentiles. Or why does not the potter have the right over the clay? Isn't it true that the potter has the right to do with his clay whatever he chooses? To make from the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for common use. In this way, common should be probably translated dishonorable use. So God said, why don't I have the choice to make things for my purposes, for use that is good, for use that is evil? No, he's not saying I created evil. God did not create evil, does not create evil or cause evil. But he creates those who do. Verse 19 says, why do people ask that same question about God's choices? And what's that question? Is it fair? I couldn't do anything about it, you say. It wasn't up to me. It wasn't up to Pharaoh. It wasn't up to Moses. God's will is going to be done. How can you blame me for doing part of that? Self-justification or self-excuse, an improper view of God and his sovereignty, or concern over one's ability to reconcile God's sovereignty with man's free will. People either looking for excuses to say, I'm not responsible, God's responsible for all of it, so I'm not responsible. Or on the other side, it's a question, does God have sovereignty and does man have free will at the same time? Look at verse 20 and 21. Notice Paul doesn't really answer the question directly. For so those who are seeking self-justification, Paul essentially says, what? Shut up. Don't you know that God is still the sovereign creator? And that your very existence dependent on him? How ridiculous is for the creature to judge the creator. This image of the potter and the clay was well known to students of the Old Testament, and all Jews would have had some idea from it, from Isaiah 64, Jeremiah 18, or Zechariah 11. There's perhaps one or more points of this illustration that are easily missed, I think. The potter has a purpose for every object he creates. The purpose for each finished product is independent of the lump of clay used. God picks out a lump and said, I'm going to make this out of it. All come from the same general lump, all a piece of the full big lump. God takes a piece out and said, from this piece I will make X, and he makes X. It is not the clay that makes the difference. It's not the piece of clay picked out. It is the potter's intent, the potter's design, the potter's skill. Now, verse 21 spoke of God's right to choose or reject each thing he makes as he sees fit. However, it's also true that God's gifting of Christians for service is his choice. So, if you're a Christian, you are chosen for God's service. But if you're a Christian, you are given grace in the way of gifts to perform that service. God assigns the purpose for all his pottery, all his creation. Contrary to how we often feel, the task assigned us is not an indication of value. One of a pot chosen or made to do X and another made to choose Y does not say that one X is of greater value or Y is of greater value. It doesn't say anything about value. It simply speaks about function, whereby it means that believers do what God has called them to do. The believer's worth is shown at salvation. Believer's worth in God's eyes is shown in salvation. But what the believer is and does is done by choice of God, what God has called them to do. So don't brag about what God has chosen to you, except for bragging that he has actually chose you for something, and so you will indeed do it. What if God, and this is now in verses 22 through 24, Paul's not finished with his arguments, said, what if God, although willing to demonstrate his wrath and to make his power known, endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction? Doesn't that describe Pharaoh? God wanted his power known worldwide by working through Pharaoh and overdoing what Pharaoh wanted to do, showing something. So God endured Pharaoh's with patience to the point where he wanted to end this whole matter. So consider, Pharaoh was a vessel of common value. It was a vessel God made for his own purposes, a vessel that he would use at some point, and God does use vessels that are not believers. And he was a vessel of wrath prepared for destruction. He was locked into his hardness, and he died in that hardness. And Yahweh did so in order that he might make known the riches of his glory upon vessels of mercy, which he prepared beforehand for glory. He wanted his power and riches to be known by who Moses is known to have been in his part. Not because of Moses, but because of God. And what about the rest? Even us. He's writing to Christians at Rome, remember. Even us, whom he also called, not from the Jews only, but also from Gentiles. So now he's going back and say, look, God does this, whether Jew or Gentile, made for common purpose, God's purpose, or made for another God's purpose, showing mercy. Some he did one thing, some he did another. The Jews are split among commonplace and vessels of mercy. The Gentiles are split between Gentiles of common choice and mercy. Verse 22 is difficult. Technically, the verse says, who or what prepared the vessels of wrath for destruction? Never does. I should have said never earlier, right? It never says who or what prepared the vessels of wrath for destruction. The word used, katartizo, Katartizo, can be taken to be in a reflexive mode or passive mode, and prepared for destruction can be interpreted as in a state of a readiness for condemnation or ripe for condemnation. Accordingly, one sees the interpretations made themselves ripe for condemnation or were made ripe for condemnation. One is reflexive, you did it to yourself. One is passive, you were not the active agent. And as a matter of fact, talks about being prepared by someone or something other than God, and in some way, every individual is prepared for destruction by themselves, and those who are prepared for salvation are prepared by God in some way. So, everyone is prepared by God in some way. Part of the preparation involves your own sinfulness, your own obstinance, your own evil, to a point, then God eventually says, that's it. That may occur at death, it may occur earlier. Both options, 1 and 2a, are attractive because God is in no way implicated in any action leading to their destruction. However, 2b may be the best interpretation given Paul's discussion. Let me go back and read 2b. Were made ripe for condemnation by God in some way. Here's Paul's argument then that we've been watching. God's judgment of sin by giving them over. That's the first place where God acts. God's decision to pass over Esau. God's rejection, or passing over. That is the point of salvation, God's decision on salvation. And then God's act of judging Pharaoh and hardening his heart. At some point he said, that's it. You've taken it to this point, I'll take it from here. You're finished. The reference to God's creation of vessels for dishonor. God created Pharaoh for that act of opposition to himself. And in verse 23, God's predestination prepared beforehand, active mode, some to receive mercy, some to receive condemnation. And this goes back and is a sort of paraphrase of some of Romans 8:29 and 30. Verses 22 and 23, when taken together, do show purposes that God has in mind for his actions. What are his purposes? Display his wrath, show his power to avenge sin, and showcase the glory of his, or the riches of his glory. Display his wrath, display his power, display his riches. It's all part of God's receiving the due glory he deserves. Again, by way of summary, regardless of which interpretation you believe is best, some points are clear. The objects of God's wrath are the unsaved. That's in Romans 1:18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in righteousness. They refuse to accept righteousness. While a single act of sin is deserving of immediate judgment, God has displayed his patience even to the non-elect. You can see that in Acts 14 and 17, Romans 3. He's giving them every chance to repent in faith, Romans 2:4, 1 Timothy 1:16, even though he knew they would not. He still exhibited the patience to give them every possible opportunity to accept. Why would he do that? Though through the non-elect, God's patience, justice, wrath, power, mercy, and righteousness will be shown clearly. Paul declares that God has an absolute right to choose those to receive mercy and those who will receive justice. Condemnation, if you please. That right extends to his making fixed the spiritual stupor the natural man has, as he did with Pharaoh. Pharaoh hardened his own heart. Finally, God said, that's it. And so man, in a sense, has brought all of this on himself. God is not responsible for his behavior that led to that point. The Bible teaches that as a moral agent made in the image of God, man is entirely responsible for his behavior and his rejection of Jesus Christ. God is just, he's righteous, he is correct in all he does. Paul never unwraps the mystery of how God's sovereignty and man's free will and responsibility fit together. Both are simply given as fact. As believers, we're required to believe and to preach and to teach what the Bible says as truth, not what we want the Bible to say as truth. I've got something that I would read here from a scholar named Douglas Moo, M-O-O, yes, Douglas Moo. He wrote some things in his epistle to Romans, said far better than I can. So let me read a couple paragraphs, actually more than a couple, I think at least 3. So let me go back to Douglas. The hardening Paul portrays in Romans 9 is a sovereign act of God that is not caused by anything in those individuals who are hardened. Anything includes things good, things bad. God's hardening does not cause spiritual insensitivity to the things of God. It maintains people in the state of sin that already characterized them. His decision is never said to be based on anything but his personal will. And that anything includes what the person does that's good, what the person does that's bad. So, tells you right off the top, you can never do enough good to offset whatever bad you do. God's bestowal of mercy, this is back to Douglas, God's bestowal of mercy and his hardening are not equivalent acts. God's mercy is given to those who do not deserve it. His hardening affects those who have already, by their sin, deserved it. And that, of course, is condemnation. In the face of the accusation that his stress on the initiative of God in determining who would be his people turns God into an unjust, unfair tyrant, Paul retreats not one step. He doesn't retreat it, he doesn't explain it, he simply states it. On the contrary, in verses 14 to 23 that we've been looking at, he goes on the offensive and strengthens his teaching about the unconstrained freedom of God in making choices that determine people's lives. Did you catch that? God's teaching, Paul's teaching about the unconstrained freedom of God to make choices that determines people's lives. This text then gives further support to the doctrine of unconditional election. You are chosen by God for no particular reason other than he chose to. More ambiguously, the doctrine of reprobation, which is the doctrine of sending one to hell that people go into. Paul teaches that God has brought upon certain people who he chooses on the basis of nothing but his own will, a condition of spiritual stupor, a condition that leads to eternal condemnation. So that's a scholar on what Paul has been trying to say. And again, Paul would say, don't argue with God. He had the right to do what he had the right to do. He said, I can choose to love and have mercy and compassion on who I choose to have love, mercy, and compassion. And I may choose to have wrath, condemnation, and damnation on who I will. End of story. But Paul is not yet finished, therefore neither are